All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Suneel Gupta. How are you doing?
I'm good, Kent. Thanks for having me on.
It is great to have you. I'll kind of go through your background, but I won't get this in any kind of order. It's pretty eclectic. You went to Kellogg, where I also went to school, but you've been a VP at Groupon, have run for Congress, teach at Harvard, somehow managed to be an emissary to the Kingdom of Bhutan, and have now written a book. The book is Backable: The Surprising Truth Behind What Makes People Take a Chance. So thanks for doing this.
I'm glad to be here.
Has anybody ever run through that whole opening and then introduced you as Sanjay?
I've had people at the end of phone calls, sort of like we're having a full conversation, and at the end of the call, they're like, "All right, great connected with you, Sanjay."
Yeah.
Although I'll tell you a funny story. So Sanjay, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, CNN, my older brother, he's about 10 years older than me. And we're, whenever we sort of, he joined CNN about 15 years ago. And so it was pretty common while we were walking around for people to come up and be like, "Hey, can I get a photo with you?" And eventually it was, "Hey, can I get a selfie with you?" And then oftentimes it would be like, "Hey," and they would turn to me, "Can you take the photo?"
Yep.
Right. So it wasn't until a couple of years ago, I'm walking down the street and it's like a 16-year-old, like a teenager. He comes up to me and he's like, "Hey, can I get a selfie with you?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay. It's Sanjay's not here. It's just me. And you want a selfie with me? Okay. Yeah. All right." And so he extends his arm. He's like in full selfie mode and he's right about to take the pic. And in the last second, he shouts out to his friend. He's like, "Hey, Jim, come get in this photo with Dr. Sanjay Gupta's brother."
Oh man. Hey, that's a step up. At least you're
At
in the
least,
picture.
yeah.
What an amazing career that guy's had. I kind of forget. I know who he is. He's famous. Because I watch CNN, but you forget that that's a global network. Like that
Yeah.
when you're in a hotel in Singapore or London or wherever, it's also on. So he and I guess you must get that all over the world now.
Yeah, well, he certainly does. He certainly does.
That's
Yeah.
incredible. So what animates this career of yours? You kind of come out of school as a lawyer, but you don't seem to have stuck with that path. Like what is this career of yours that you've kind of put I mean, Sanjay did something really incredible, but he basically became a doctor and then took another step to kind of share his knowledge with the world.
Huh.
You've done a lot of different things.
Yeah, I do think Sanjay is one of the ultimate backable stories. Journalism, he didn't have any experience with it, had no on-air experience, and yet was able to convince some pretty hard-nosed people at CNN at the time to kind of take a chance on him. And I think it's an incredible sort of backable moment. For me, I guess it's sort of, I think if there's one thing that kind of unifies it all together, I've been really fascinated by people who have been able to transform themselves and their careers. And I think the thing that I continue to come back to over and over again is that a lot of the people that we admire and we're seeing the current day version of. But if you rewind the tape and you start to look at early versions of their stories, you start to see sometimes a different thing. And the first time that I realized this was in 2004. I was working as a junior level speechwriter at the Democratic National Convention, and so this is in Boston. And you're backstage. I'm backstage at the convention. I'm seeing all sort of the usual suspects. It's the Clintons, it's the Gores, it's the Liebermans,
Yep.
but there was one person that no one really seemed to recognize, and that was a state senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. And he gets up there and he gives that speech that night that I think changes a lot of things. And I got to watch that speech from backstage. So while everybody was watching him, I felt like I was watching everybody. And it was like this tidal wave of energy that just kind of ripped through the stadium, and including me, where I became, I think, one of millions of people who got very, very interested in Barack Obama and his story. So I started to kind of just dig deeper and rewind the clock a little bit. And what I realized is that, in the year 2000, so 4 years before that speech, Barack Obama had run for Congress. So not for Senate, not for president. He'd run for Congress and he had lost. And he had lost by a big margin. It was a 2-1 margin. But what stood out to me more than that was the way that he was received during that campaign, people described him as boring, stilted, professorial.
Yeah.
There was a reporter named Ted McClelland who covered that campaign, who said that Barack Obama is so dry that he sucks the air right out of the room.
Yeah.
And then 4 years later, he's just this bastion of inspiration, hope, and energy,
Right.
enchanting millions and millions of young people. And so it just turned me on to this idea that the story that we're seeing right now wasn't always the way it was. And that's I think that's inspiring. I think it's even more inspiring than seeing the current day version, because that means that we can do that as well. And I think that that's ultimately what Backable is all about. It's like there are these Backable people who seem to have this it quality, but they didn't always have that it quality. It was learned. It wasn't,
Yeah.
they weren't born that way. And that means that we can learn it as well.
And so as you put this book together, the book is called Backable, and the concept of backable in most people's minds pretty quickly goes to a financial endeavor where you back them, you back an entrepreneur. But your book went beyond that, right? Didn't you talk to, like, well, obviously Barack Obama would be a not a business, chefs, other types of successful people.
Yeah, I mean, we cast a wide net because being backable is not just for celebrities. It's not just for CEOs. I think it's for all of us. I ended up spending time talking to Oscar-winning filmmakers, Michelin star chefs, military leaders, of course, founders of iconic companies, but people who are inside bigger companies as well and trying to create change inside places that are resistant to change. Um, and I think that it's not just for certain types of people. I think the reason it's for all of us is because we're all trying to create some type of change. That might be with our careers, that might be with our community, that might be with the companies that we're working with, but we're all trying to create some kind of change. And no matter what type of change that is, no one really does it alone. We need hiring managers. We need teams, partners, clients, even friends and family to be with us for the ride.
So if you take someone like Barack Obama, what is going on in that sort of interregnum between when he, is sucking the air out of the room and when he's energizing an entire country?
Mm.
What's going on in there?
Yeah, I think in his case, I think a huge part of that 4 year journey was playing what we call in the book exhibition matches. What exhibition matches are, they're basically low stakes practice sessions before you get into a high stakes moment.
Mm.
And the reason that this is really important is because, again, when we see people who seem to be naturally great in a room, what I've realized is when I dig behind the scenes, they're typically the product of lots and lots of practice. Again, what we call these exhibition matches. And these exhibition matches don't look all that great. Oftentimes they're very sloppy. But I think one mantra that backable people seem to have adopted, consciously or subconsciously, is that long-term success comes from short-term embarrassment. But you might as well embarrass yourself in front of friendly people if you're going
Right.
to embarrass yourself. You might as well do that in front of friends, in front of family, in front of low stakes clients, low stakes partners before you get into sort of that real moment. And so there are a couple of ground rules that I think are really important for playing these practice sessions. One of them is that no venue is too small. You can be playing these exhibition matches with friends and with family. If a friend calls you up and says, "Hey, what are you up to these days?" and you're working on something, instead of giving them an overview, actually say, "Hey, can you jump on the phone or jump on a Zoom and I want to give you the actual presentation. Like, let me give you the actual pitch. No director's commentary, like the real version."
Yep.
That's one. The second is that I think the question that we ask after we share something with somebody is very, very important. So typically, the question that I think most of us, including me, want to ask after we give someone our idea is, "Hey, so what do you think?" Right? But typically, that question, "What do you think?" doesn't really give us the insight and feedback that we need to actually get better. What I notice is that backable people tend to go one layer deeper and ask a question like, "What moments stood out to you in what I just told you?"
Right.
Or even saying to somebody, "Can you, like, after you give a 10-minute pitch, say to them, 'Can you describe back to me, just summarize back to me what you heard?'"
Yeah.
Because that really gives you that insight on, like, what's really resonating with people and what's not.
I think one of the things that's interesting about your book is that people appropriately have a tendency to clean up the story later on. So in other words, if you were kind of a stuttering, Gavin Newsom in California, dyslexic, and wasn't, maybe a great speaker early on, but once you get good, you don't revisit it and let people know you're just that guy now. So
Yeah.
I think that may be why some people tend to think, oh, I could never be like that, because you don't think of Barack Obama as ever having a phase where he wasn't the most, charismatic person on the planet.
I think that's totally right. I mean, it's not often that you find people that say, look, take a look at an early version of me. Thank God we have YouTube, and you can go and you can go look at these speeches. Just take a classic example like the 2007 launch of the iPhone. We kind of look back on that presentation as like being one of the greatest, most charismatic product announcements of all time. Go take a look at that speech on YouTube, and you might be a little bit surprised. I certainly was, because we sort of lionized it. But if you look at the transcript, Steve Jobs used the word over 80 times in
Yeah.
that speech. He spends a lot of time looking at his feet and sort of
Right.
meandering on and off script. It's actually it's very much not a charismatic presentation.
Yeah. And he, like Barack Obama, famously cleaned that up because he later gives a speech at Stanford, which really is a
Yes.
great speech. That's about him at the time surviving cancer, and it's structured almost like a Shakespearean uh, scene,
Yeah.
beautifully structured. And so he
Yeah.
obviously went and kind of figured it out.
I think that's right. I think the process is very iterative. I think playing these exhibition matches, the other thing we talk about in the book that I think is really important is who is going to help you clean it up. And what we find is that the backable people tend to have four certain personalities in their circle, four different types of friends or family members or colleagues that are in their backable circle. And I call these people the four C's. And so the first C is your collaborator. And so when you're with this person, you feel like you're like in a musical jam session with them. They're using language like yes and just building on top of your idea. The second is your coach. And the reason that your collaborator is different than your coach is because while your collaborator is focused typically on whether your idea fits the market or whether it fits your company, your coach is also thinking about, does this idea really fit you? Like, does it feel like something you're going to want to go work on? And that's so important, right? Because when we go try to make any type of change, we're going to be on the other side of doubt and rejection, and we need to have enough emotional juice in the tank. And we can only have that if we're actually really into the idea. It actually makes us tick. And your coach is somebody who's going to be honest with you about that. The third is your cheerleader. And your cheerleader it's pretty self-explanatory, but we all kind of need this person in our lives where we can call them and no matter what, they're going to give us that little boost that we sometimes need. I studied one of the people I studied for the book was a woman named Ellen Levy, who Fast
Yeah.
Company magazine
She,
named the most connected woman in Silicon Valley.
yep.
Yeah, I'm sure you know her, Kent.
Yep.
And she's got a massive Rolodex, Fortune 500 CEOs, members of Congress. And I was like, Ellen, who do you call before you walk into a big meeting, a big presentation? She said, that's easy. I call my mom. My
That's,
mom is who I call before I walk into
yeah.
that big moment. The fourth C is my favorite. I think it's the least appreciated, and it's your critic. But I call this person your cheddar. And the reason I call this person your cheddar is if you've ever seen the movie 8 Mile, Eminem is surrounded by a circle of friends who are always kind of like building him up. But there's one friend named Cheddar who is always kind of like, poking holes in his ideas and sort of pointing out kind of like the blind spots. And while Cheddar is really annoying, what we realize throughout the film is that it's Cheddar who's really getting Eminem ready for the stage.
Yep.
And I think the same thing is true in our careers and lives. Is like there tend to be people who we want to push out because they're kind of poking holes in our ideas, but those are the people who I think really get us ready for these backable moments. And so what I notice is that backable people tend to sort of find at least one cheddar who they know have had their best intentions at heart, and they tend to, instead of push that person away, they really embrace that person, really bring their cheddar in.
That's that's fantastic. And as we move through a career with these people, something I'm struck, I haven't been able to really articulate this, but you kind of get to it in your book, how one moves through a career. If you think about what you've done or what your brother's done, Like your brother couldn't have sat at the beginning. Oh, maybe he did, but I can't imagine he sat at the beginning of a career and said, "I'm going to go to med school. I'm going to study biology. Then I'm going to become a surgeon. And then obviously I'm going to take the next step, which is go be a global presence on CNN." There's just some kind of path that has to do with being in the mix and getting going. And I don't know if it's like a concept like jazz, but kind of being a little free with your
Hmm.
career. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely see it, in I think people's careers. I think you see kind of a couple of different archetypes, and one is sort of the architect, where they sort of design the blueprint up front, and then no matter what, they're going to go build that damn blueprint. They're going to build that building,
Right.
right? And then you find the archaeologist, where it's kind of like, oh, I think that's interesting right now. Like, I think it's very interesting. Let me go dig and go see what I can find and be completely focused on that. But then maybe something else is interesting, and so after a while I'll go look at that. And I think that, you don't necessarily have to be one or the other, but I think you can be a combination of both. The question that's always fascinated me is like, what happens when you get to a point where you're not happy anymore and you want to go do something different? What are the pressures that sort of, tend to sort of keep us in place? And some of those are real pressures, like I got to put food on the
Right.
table. I have no damn choice here. I've knocked down over 10,000 doors here in Michigan while I was running for Congress. And my district is has some of the poorest people in the state and some of the richest people in the state. And I certainly there are a lot of people in my district that don't necessarily have the choice, I think, the privilege of being able to say, look, let me go do something different here. But there's a lot of people that do have that privilege and they don't.
Yeah.
And I think there's other things that sort of hold us in place. And so it's funny, I went to my law school reunion a few years ago, and afterwards I ended up grabbing beers with a buddy of mine, somebody I hadn't talked to in years. And it was just clear to me that, like, he wasn't very happy. And I just I decided to press him a little bit. I'm like, well, what's going on? Tell me more. Like, what's going on? What happens if you leave and you go do something else? And what became clear to me in this conversation, again after a couple of beers, is that he was practicing law not because he wanted to be a lawyer, but because he had a law degree.
Right.
Right. I mean, he had put in the work, he had put in the effort, and he's like, look, I'm not going to let all that sort of go to waste, like, or at least perceived go to waste. Um, and so I think that there's this notion of, like, does our past really determine our future? And I think that you find some people that say, yeah, it's all got to sort of line up. It's got to be linear. And I think you have others who say, no, not necessarily.
How do you think risk has changed over time? What people call taking a risk. As guys like me do, watch like History Channel shows about the founding of food companies, like the guy who founded Kraft,
Mm,
the guy who founded Kentucky Fried Chicken. And these guys started their huge businesses broke in a strange city with like $600 in their pocket,
mm.
at a time when there's no even social safety net kind of thing, such as that is. And now when people take a risk, you raise $1 million from,
Yeah,
XYZ VC, and yeah, it's a risk in that you're not at McKinsey for a couple of years, but it
exactly.
feels like it's not the same as some immigrants in the past have gone through to build a business.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I look at my mom's story. She was raised in a refugee camp. No running water, no electricity. They're on the border of Pakistan and India. And she decides that, she wants to become an engineer with Ford Motor Company. Her parents saved every penny they had to get behind the dream. She gets to the United States. She's got a few $100s in her pocket. She somehow gets a scholarship to Oklahoma State University that covers her cost of tuition and a lot of her boarding. But then after that, she drives to Detroit, broke, and basically, like, tries to find a job, find her dream job. Ends up in a room with a hiring manager, gets an interview, and he looks at her resume, looks at her application. He says, like, "Are you applying for the job of an engineer?" And she's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, I'm sorry, we actually don't have any female engineers working here right now." Because this was the 1960s, and while Ford Motor Company had thousands of engineers on staff, not a single one of them was a woman.
Seems insane.
It's insane.
Yeah.
And so she gets up and she's like deflated. She picks up her resume and her purse and she, starts to walk out of the room. And then in this last minute effort, she sort of turns around and she tells this guy her story, like of all the struggle of like being, where she was wanting this and the journey she had to take to get to the country, to get to Detroit, to get to this very room. And then she's like, look, if you don't have any female engineers, then do yourself a favor and hire me now. And this guy was so moved by her story that he gave her that shot and he took a chance on her and she became Ford Motor Company's first female engineer. But getting back to your point, Kent, like I think about that story all the time, not only because like is it like the basis, I think, of my story and the basis of this book in a lot of ways, but it's also kind of like, well, what would have happened had that failed, had that plan actually
Right.
not come together, right? Because you're right, she only had a few $100s in her pocket. What would she have done? And I get all this credit sometimes for like, wow, you did something, like you went and took a risk by starting a business, or you took a risk by running for Congress. Yeah, but not really, because I would have had a roof over my head. My kids would have been fine. Like they'd still be able to, have an education and have healthcare and have, food on the table. Like the essentials would have been met. And so like I don't consider the level of risk I take with any of the stuff I do to even be in the same ballpark.
Yeah. Man, instead of writing another book, the next thing you should do is write a screenplay about your mom's experience at Ford Motor Company in the 60s.
I know.
That's that's
It's
got to be
crazy.
backable.
Yeah, there's this moment that really stands out where a guy, like, so she's now there and unsurprisingly there are a lot of people who don't necessarily want her to be there, and they make it known, and I'll say this to my mom's credit, like she did not try to be someone that she was not.
Yeah.
She did not try to fake an American accent. She did not start dressing in Indian clothes. She did. I'm sorry, in American clothes. She dressed the way that she would dress. She did not change her name. She was who she was. And a guy comes up to her at one of the manufacturing plants one day, and he just says to her flat out, he says, "Go back to your own country."
Yeah.
And she says, "This is my country." And he looks at her and he says, "Go back to your kitchen." And she looks at him and she says, "This is my kitchen."
Oh man, that's fantastic. Now, years later, when you're out in the field running for Congress in Michigan, how are you received as an Indian guy tooling around? Uh, yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there's never been anybody in my district who's been sent to Congress. It's been, that's had my skin color.
Yeah.
And it's all been white. And it was interesting because I think there are two types of racism, and I think one I certainly knew about, which is like people who are kind of in your face about it, and they're
Mhm.
like, I don't like you, and or they slam the door in your face, and in some ways that's actually like, I'm used to it enough where it's like that's actually not so bad because it's kind of like, all right, let me move on to the next person.
Yeah.
The other type of racism is a little more tricky where it's kind of like I don't really know what to do with it, which is like they actually kind of like you, but they also come across kind of racist. I was leaving a debate one time and I was in the parking lot. I was walking to my car and I overheard a couple of guys talking, and one of the guys, like, they'd been in the audience. He's like, "Well, what did you think?" And he's like, "Well, I think that sand jockey made some good points."
Wow.
Or,
Right. Yeah.
right? Or the camel jockey made
Yeah.
some good
Yeah.
points. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I don't know what to do with that. I really don't. Or you're in a meeting, and I'm giving a speech, and someone says, "Hey, look, part of the reason that I'm not interested in you as a candidate is the color of your skin." But and they're like, "But I don't have a problem with that. I'm not racist, but my neighbor is racist."
Yeah.
And if my neighbor's racist, then I know he's not going to vote for you, and that means that, like, you're not going to win. And so for that reason, I'm not as interested in your candidacy. I think that's the type of sort of um that's the type of, I think, bias that I think is much more tricky.
Yeah. And so, what do you walk away from all that with, to use a lot of prepositions? Would you run again? Are you discouraged? Are you hardened? Like, what's the?
Oh no, I'd totally run again. I mean, I totally run again, and I would totally encourage people to run again. You know, one of the actually so great love this moment. Like one of the volunteers on my campaign who was not a politics person. He worked at a manufacturing plant, but like really got interested in the campaign. He's Indian as well, and wanted to see an Indian get elected. And when I didn't, he said, you know what, I'm still interested enough. Let me go run. And he
Yeah.
did. And he ran at a state level and he became the first person of color to be elected from his district.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
so I absolutely, I think that like, I'm even more sort of resolved that like we need more people who look different
Right.
running right now.
So you moved there from San Francisco to run, is that right?
Yeah.
And so you're in Birmingham, which is near Detroit, right?
Yeah. It's about 15 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. All the Northwestern kids I went to school with were from Bloomfield Hills, which I think is
Yeah.
where
Right.
all the auto execs live. So you moved to Michigan before that was cool, like before moving out of San Francisco was cool.
Yeah.
And you stayed after you lost, right?
Yeah, I did. It's funny. I think about this. I thought about this a lot when I was writing the book too. One of the things that came up in the book was the notion of the IKEA effect. And the IKEA effect basically shows us that we place up to 5 times the amount of value on something that we help build than something that we simply buy off the shelf.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of people out there that have poorly made futons and furniture that they're never going to get rid of because they built it themselves. And I bring it up in the book in the context of creativity, which is that we have been told that innovation is a two-step formula. You come up with a great idea and then you execute on it well. But there is really this hidden step in between where what we do is we flip outsiders into insiders and we make it their idea as well. These are early employees, these are early partners, early investors where they feel like they help build this thing with you. And I think you can trace every successful movement, organization, company back to this hidden step. But I also think this hidden step is very important in relationships. And what ended up happening is that in my relationship in 2016, after Donald Trump was elected president, I was like, I want to, my hometown, my home district flipped in 2016 from blue to red for
Mm.
the first time in a long time. And I started spending a lot more time back there and finally said, I want to move back. I've been in a bubble for too long in Silicon Valley. I want to move back. I want to get involved and maybe I want to run for office. And I run this idea by my wife, who looks at me and she says, I hate that idea.
Yeah.
Like I hate it. I don't want to leave. Like we our second daughter had just been born. We financially had finally found a way to make things kind of make ends meet in San Francisco. And she's like, I feel like you're pulling the rug out from underneath us now. And so for the next few months, we kind of just had this just really, I think a hard point in our relationship where it was kind of like this back and forth where I'd be like, I really want to do this. And she'd be like, I really don't want to do this. And what I realized over time is that I was really just trying to sell her a piece of furniture,
Yeah.
and so what we arrived on was a plan. And the plan was, we're going to move to Michigan. I'm likely going to run for office. If I win, then obviously we stay. But if I lose, then you get the choice on where we move next. No questions asked. It's 100% in your hands.
Yeah.
Now, that didn't necessarily make her feel great about the idea of moving to Michigan in the first place, but it made her part of the overall plan. We were building this piece of furniture together.
That's fantastic. And the best thing is, well, how have you found it being in the Midwest? I lived there for a while. Like, what's it like compared to, gutting it out in San Francisco?
I like the Midwest. I mean, I really like being here. I think that there's a sense of a sense of 0 to 1 that I feel attracted to anyway. I always have. Um, and I think that I start to get a little bit bored when it's the story after the one. And so I think for me, Detroit is a really good place to sort of hang my hat and be around. Um, I think that the thing, that Lena and I really value now, I think a lot more than we did before, is a sense of community.
Yeah.
I took a trip to Bhutan a couple of years ago, and I started to get really involved in what was happening in that country. Just fascinated by it because they run their country based on what they call gross national happiness.
Hmm.
That's how they measure progress. And it's imperfect, just like any other country. But what I love about it is that they have this North Star, which is that, economic growth is important, but it all feeds into something that we think is much larger, which is the happiness of our people. And when I was out there, I had a chance to spend some time with the research team, the people who actually collect all the data. And I asked him, when you're going town to town and doing the surveys and collecting the information, is there a single question that you can ask that can give you a really strong indicator of how happy somebody is? And they said, yeah, there actually is. And that question is, if you were in real trouble, who could you call and know with 100% certainty they would be there for you?
Hmm.
And they believe that people who can answer that question are much more likely to be happy. But there's a twist. And the twist is, whose list are you on? Like, who can call
Right.
you and know with 100% certainty you are going to be there for them?
Hmm.
It's not a line, it's a circle.
Yeah.
And I think that circle is what I think maybe we didn't have as much of in a place like Silicon Valley that we feel just is robust and rich here in the Midwest.
Yeah. It's a little bit transactional here. Also, warm summer nights, I got to say.
Yeah, warm summer nights are
Like
great.
like after a
Walking around
hard cold
t-shirt.
winter in Chicago, you never get this in San Francisco, but in Chicago, it'll be like 80 degrees at 10 o'clock at night and nobody's asleep. Everybody's out.
Yeah,
Everybody's at the beer gardens playing softball. It's
yeah.
it's 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 pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also kind of like March comes around, March, April comes around, and all of a sudden, I mean, it's not that warm. It's like, 60 degrees. People are out there in t-shirts.
Yep.
And it's this moment where it's almost like we've gone through something together. Like
Yeah.
everybody's in this celebratory, like we made it
Yeah.
mood. And there's
You,
nothing like it.
you really feel I tell people I lived in Chicago and I tell people that I'm like, look, they're like, oh, the winters suck. And you're like, no, the winter doesn't really suck because November and December is actually kind of it's nice, it's bracing. You get to do your winter wardrobe. It's
Yeah.
Christmas, it's
It's
good.
festive. Yeah.
Yeah. January, it's February.
Yeah.
February, you're
Yeah.
done and
You're
it's
done.
cold and icy and slushy.
Yes.
And then March and April, and it's just lovely.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
So is the Detroit thing going to happen? People have always been talking about Detroit having, yeah, you move there, the artists move there for the cheap
Mhm.
homes, and the technology people move there for the community. Is that been put on hold by COVID, or how's that all going?
Yeah, I think it's been very tough. Just like I think in a lot of places, and I think because local, I think has such a heartbeat in a place like Detroit, local businesses, and I think there's been a lot of pride towards local art, and I think a lot of that has been I think has been hurt. But I will say that one thing about a place like Detroit is that you go and for me, talking to small business owners, talking to people who've been hugely impacted, whereas in other places you kind of have this almost feeling of like how the fuck could this happen, and like you almost kind of throwing your hands up in the air. Detroiters almost by nature almost has this mentality of like, yeah, like we've been through this before, like it sucks, and like 5 years ago we went through something that sucked, and 10 years ago we went through something that sucked, and like we're not like we're down but we're not out.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why I love Detroit.
So what happens? So now you've written this book, Backable, which I assume people can get anywhere, and it's become, as I understand, trying to parse the different charts, doing pretty well. You've got a book,
Yeah.
your brother's got a book. So what happens next for you? Like, what's the plan here?
Yeah, so I'm writing another book.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I'm writing another book. I didn't set out to do this. Again, I'm an archaeologist and not an architect,
Yeah.
but I go towards stuff that I think is really interesting. And every morning my daughter and I play a little game, and I ask her two questions, and the two questions are, what is the meaning of life? And she says, to find your gift. And I say, what is the purpose of life? And she says, to give it away. And I think Backable is very much about how do we give our gift away. It's really about the second question. And I've been very attracted for a very long time with the first question as well, which is how do we find what our gift really is?
Right.
And that's what this next book is going to be about.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. That's a Picasso thing, right?
It's Picasso,
Yeah.
exactly.
Amazing. Yeah. I went to a liberal arts college.
Yeah, I can tell.
um,
So does that mean you're a poet at Kellogg?
yeah. I went
You're
to
in the poet
Northwestern
section?
undergrad too.
Oh, okay, that's
Kellogg was
right, right.
transnational. Northwestern undergrad, I got to say, I really, I know Harvard and Stanford. I had a
Yeah.
great time.
Oh,
It,
it's
it,
such a great campus.
it's the Midwest. I mean, we literally had hay rides. I mean, come on, people. It was great. Well, how do people, other than buying the book, Backable, The Surprising Truth Behind What Makes People Take a Chance, um, how do people also follow what you're thinking and doing? And is it
Yeah.
Twitter or LinkedIn? What's your,
Yeah, I've been trying to stay active on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Yeah, if you go to the website, which is backable.com, you'll see kind of, what I'm up to. You'll see some free content out there, and you have a chance to check out more and go a little bit deeper. And if you like
yeah.
the book, you can check it out. But yeah, I'll be much more active. I'll be posting a lot of stuff. And one of the things I didn't do with Backable, but I intend on doing for this next book is posting along the way.
Oh,
So
yeah.
little moments that are standing out to me. What I was doing with Backable is I was writing them down, but now I feel like I should just talk them out and share them and get
Yeah.
feedback.
That's great. Well, Backable is the book. It's just really satisfying. Like it's just cool. Like it's great stories. I obviously highly recommend it. And I'm glad we got to spend some time here. Thanks so much for doing this.
This has been great, Ken. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, thanks a lot. Suneel Gupta has been my guest. This has been the Something About Your podcast. Talk to you next time.